Welcome. Tonight, I'll take you back to the dark, yet fascinating world of the Middle Ages. You can close your eyes or simply listen to my voice. Take a deep breath and let the words gently carry you toward sleep. In this video, we'll explore the unseen burdens of wealth, examining what was truly awful about being rich in medieval times. But don't worry. Everything will move slowly, peacefully. If you enjoy this kind of story, please consider subscribing to the channel and let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? Your words always mean a lot, and a little like helps this journey reach others too. Now, if you're ready, let's begin. As night descends, our thoughts often drift to the grand castles of the medieval era, to the nobles swimming in wealth and their opulent lives. Glistening armor, magnificent feasts, loyal servants. Sounds like a dream, doesn't it? In the tableau that forms in our minds, there's a world where wealth is the cure for every ill, solving every problem. Yet history whispers a much more complex and often unsettling truth. What if beneath that gleaming surface lay a reality often overlooked? What if even the wealthiest of that era had to endure horrifying truths that would seem unimaginable to modern humans? Tonight, we will journey into those dark corners, beyond the gold-embroidered fabrics and grand banquets. We will listen to the whispers of what was truly the worst part about being rich in the Middle Ages. And we shall see that no matter how affluent you were in that period, there were certain pains and fears that no amount of fortune could ever buy away. Imagine for a moment that you are a medieval noble. You possess a vast castle, expansive lands, and hundreds of peasants. You consume the finest foods and don the most exquisite garments. You hold power and status. But do you know what your immense fortune could not procure for you in that era? Health? Yes, you heard that correctly. Wealth was no shield against relentless adversaries like the plague, smallpox, or typhus. In fact, in some respects, being rich even exposed you to particular dangers. Medical knowledge of the period, by today's standards, was exceedingly primitive. Widespread beliefs about the causes of illness revolved around concepts like bad air, the miasma theory, or divine punishment. Unaware of modern germ theory, physicians often operated on observation and superstition. As a noble, you certainly had access to better doctors than the common folk. However, better here was a relative term. These practitioners commonly employed expensive ointments, herbal remedies, astrological predictions, and perhaps, most frighteningly, bloodletting. Bloodletting was a common practice believed to expel bad humors from the body and hasten recovery. More often than not, this merely weakened an already frail and ill body. Consider an example. You have a fever, a severe cough, and aching muscles. Your doctor arrives, checks your pulse, perhaps examines your tongue. Then, he would likely draw some blood from your arm or leg. This procedure often led to the patient's condition worsening, as the loss of blood diminished the body's ability to fight infection. And what about the plague? The Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe's population, spared neither rich nor poor. Even the thick walls of castles were insufficient against this insidious enemy. The wealthy would attempt to escape to their rural manors when the plague arrived. But this was not always effective. Plague-carrying rats and fleas would cunningly sneak into travel bags, accompanying you to your new sanctuary. Life in a castle, due to the inadequate hygiene conditions of the period, was an ideal breeding ground for rodents and insects, further increasing the risk of epidemic diseases. The tables of the wealthy often overflowed with copious amounts of meat and wine. However, access to fresh vegetables and fruits, especially during winter months, was extremely limited. This led to vitamin and mineral deficiencies, making the rich more susceptible to ailments like gout. Excessive meat consumption and insufficient fiber intake also brought about digestive problems. The hygiene conditions in medieval kitchens were far from today's standards, increasing the risk of food poisoning. Organizing grand feasts, while a display of wealth, was an immense logistical challenge fraught with such risks. In short, the first great curse of being rich in the Middle Ages was the absence of the comfort and assurance of modern medicine. Your fortune might bring you the finest doctors, but their knowledge, unless by sheer luck, would offer little genuine assistance. Every illness, every fever, every cough felt like a potential death sentence, and this fear would stealthily permeate even the walls of the most magnificent castles. In our journey so far, we have murmured about the chilling breath of plague that even wealth could not ward off, and the surprising discomforts that permeated the grandest of medieval castles. From the biting cold of stone halls to the constant lack of privacy, we've seen that true ease was often a distant dream. Now, let us turn our gaze to perhaps the most iconic symbol of medieval opulence, the feast. Images of lavish banquets, overflowing tables, and endless streams of exotic dishes dance in our minds. Yet, even here, in the very heart of their indulgence, the wealthy of the Middle Ages faced hidden vexations and genuine perils that would astonish us today. Imagine yourself seated at the high table in your great hall, surrounded by courtiers, minstrels, and the aroma of roasted meats. Ducks, swans, boars, venison, a veritable mountain of flesh would be laid before you. This abundance of meat was indeed a sign of immense wealth and power, a stark contrast to the peasant's humble diet of grains and vegetables. However, this very abundance held a hidden flaw: balance. The medieval diet of the rich was severely lacking in fresh produce. Vegetables, if consumed, were often boiled into submission, losing much of their nutritional value, and fresh fruits were strictly seasonal and hard to come by, especially during the long, harsh winters. This meat-heavy diet, devoid of sufficient vitamins and fiber, often led to a range of unpleasant and debilitating health conditions. Gout, for instance, was frequently referred to as the disease of kings or rich man's disease. This excruciatingly painful form of arthritis, caused by an excess of uric acid, would swell and inflame joints, making every step a torment. Imagine having access to all the finest foods, only to suffer from a crippling ailment brought on by your very indulgence. Beyond gout, indigestion, constipation, and various other digestive complaints were common companions to the wealthy. The concept of refrigeration was, of course, millennia away. Preserving food was a constant battle against spoilage. Meats were heavily salted, smoked, or dried. While effective in preventing immediate rot, these methods altered the texture and often intensified the flavor, making food incredibly salty or tough. Fish, a staple on fast days dictated by the church, was often dried or heavily salted to withstand transport. The concept of fresh in medieval times was vastly different from our understanding today. This meant that even the most exquisite dishes might carry a subtle, undesirable undertone of preservation, or worse, be on the verge of turning. Sweet treats, such as pastries and custards, were abundant, sweetened with honey or the incredibly expensive imported sugar. While delightful, this lavish consumption of sugars, coupled with the complete absence of dental hygiene as we know it, led to widespread and agonizing dental problems. Tooth decay, abscesses, and tooth loss were common, causing constant pain and making eating a difficult ordeal. Imagine enduring a feast with a throbbing toothache, unable to truly savor the expensive delicacies before you. Then there was the matter of hygiene in the kitchens themselves. While your castle kitchen might be a hive of activity with numerous cooks and scullery maids, the standards of cleanliness were rudimentary at best. Open fires, unwashed hands, lack of pest control, and the close proximity of raw and cooked ingredients made food contamination a constant threat. Food poisoning, though not understood in its modern context, was a frequent and debilitating occurrence. A seemingly splendid feast could quickly turn into a source of widespread illness, affecting not just the guests, but the noble family itself. The very food that signified their status could ironically be a harbinger of severe discomfort or worse. And the grand feasts themselves, while a display of power and prestige, were often more of a logistical nightmare than a joyous occasion for the host. The sheer effort required to source, transport, prepare, and serve dozens of complex dishes for hundreds of guests was immense. Everything had to be meticulously planned, from hunting the game to baking the intricate subtleties, elaborate, edible sculptures designed to impress. The pressure to maintain such a lavish lifestyle and entertain in a manner befitting one's status was a constant, exhausting burden. The host, rather than relaxing and enjoying, was often consumed by worry over the smooth execution of the event, the satisfaction of their guests, and the immense cost. So, while images of grand medieval banquets might entice us, the reality for the wealthy was a diet that often brought discomfort and disease, food that was always a gamble with freshness, and the constant, silent anxiety of managing a display of abundance that masked a surprising lack of true gustatory pleasure or peace of mind. As we drift further into the quiet realities of medieval life, having explored the chilling health concerns and the surprising lack of warmth within Grand Castle walls, our journey now brings us to the very heart of noble existence. The medieval table. For many, the mere thought of a medieval feast conjures images of unbridled extravagance, a never-ending bounty of food and drink, a stark contrast to the sparse meals of the common folk. Yet, even on the most sumptuously laden tables, the wealthy often encountered a unique set of culinary burdens, digestive discomforts, and silent anxieties that would astonish the modern diner. Imagine the great hall, filled with the murmur of voices and the faint aroma of roasted game. Platters piled high with various meats, venison, boar, swan, goose, would be presented with theatrical flair. This impressive display was, first and foremost, a statement of status and power, a visual testament to the Lord's wealth and ability to provision his household and guests. However, beneath this dazzling spectacle of abundance lay a monotonous reality. The noble diet, while rich in protein and often fat, was surprisingly narrow in its true diversity. Fresh vegetables and fruits, crucial for a balanced diet, were scarce for much of the year, utterly dependent on the short growing seasons and the challenges of preservation. This heavy reliance on cured meats and grains with minimal fresh produce brought about an array of chronic and painful ailments. Gout, as we touched upon earlier, was indeed the infamous rich man's disease, but it was not alone. Without a steady supply of fresh vitamin C, even nobles could suffer from early symptoms of scurvy, manifesting as lethargy, aching joints, and a general malaise, often attributed to other causes. Their substantial meat consumption, coupled with rich sauces and ample ale or wine, placed immense strain on their digestive systems, leading to frequent bouts of indigestion, constipation, and discomfort that no amount of wealth could alleviate. Sleep, already elusive in cold, drafty castles, would be further disturbed by the body's internal complaints after a heavy, imbalanced meal. The very act of preserving food, essential in an age without refrigeration, introduced its own set of undesirable characteristics. Meats and fish were heavily salted, smoked, or pickled to extend their shelf life. While this prevented outright spoilage, it often resulted in food that was incredibly tough, overly briny, or infused with an acrid, smoky flavor. The subtle nuances of fresh ingredients were lost beneath layers of preservation. Every bite, even of the most expensive dish, often came with a compromise on texture and palate, a far cry from the delicate flavors we expect from haute cuisine today. The constant low-level worry of whether a particular dish was truly safe or merely preserved enough would linger, a silent anxiety at every meal. Sweet treats, while a luxurious highlight, presented their own bitter truth. Honey was a common sweetener, and imported sugar, though exorbitantly expensive, became a coveted status symbol. These were lavishly used in pastries, candied fruits, and sweet wines. However, the complete absence of effective dental hygiene meant that this indulgence came at a steep price. Rampant tooth decay, painful abscesses, and premature tooth loss were incredibly common. Imagine displaying your wealth with a mouthful of rotten teeth, or enduring a grand banquet with the constant throb of a severe toothache, with no real dentist to offer relief beyond a crude extraction. And finally, the hidden dangers of the medieval kitchen itself. While your castle kitchen would be a bustling, smoky domain filled with dozens of servants, modern standards of cleanliness were non-existent. Open fires, communal water sources, the lack of sterile conditions, and the constant presence of vermin meant that food contamination was a very real and persistent threat. Instances of food poisoning, though not understood scientifically, were undoubtedly common. A grand feast, intended to solidify alliances and showcase power, could ironically become a silent source of widespread illness, affecting not just the assembled guests, but the noble family itself, a quiet testament to the unseen perils of their daily bread. Thus, the opulent banquets of the medieval rich, while appearing to offer endless delight, were often fraught with dietary imbalances, compromised flavors, hidden health risks, and a surprising lack of true gustatory pleasure, leaving even the most powerful with a lingering sense of unease. As we continue our quiet descent into the realities of the medieval wealthy, having contemplated the silent battles against illness, the unyielding cold of stone halls, and the subtle dangers hidden within grand feasts, we now turn to a more overt, yet equally insidious, burden, the constant threat to one's very existence. In an age where power was often seized through force, and justice was frequently a reflection of might, a substantial fortune became less a shield and more a glaring target, drawing unwanted attention from every direction. Imagine, if you will, the constant hum of anxiety that must have permeated the great halls. Your formidable castle, while a symbol of strength, was also a beacon for those who sought to take what you had by force. Raids from ambitious rival lords, skirmishes over disputed lands, or outright sieges were not mere tales. They were stark, terrifying possibilities. A neighboring count, driven by greed or a long-simmering feud, might suddenly appear at your gates. While your castle walls offered protection, prolonged sieges meant starvation, disease, and the dread of a breach. Even if you survived, your lands could be ravaged and your wealth diminished. Beyond your fortified walls, travel itself was inherently perilous. Roads and waterways were largely unpoliced. Bandits and ruthless outlaws lurked in forests, viewing wealthy travelers and their retinues as irresistible prey. Your armed guards offered some deterrence, but even they could be overwhelmed. The risk of ambush, robbery, or capture for ransom was a constant shadow that accompanied every journey, whether to the king's court or a distant manor. Each departure from your stronghold was an act of profound vulnerability. But the dangers were not confined to external threats. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval wealth was the insidious political intrigue that festered within one's own court and family. Your vast fortune and influence were magnets for both envy and naked ambition. Rivals, eager to usurp your lands or eliminate competition, often resorted to treachery. The very real fear of assassination or a slow, agonizing poisoning was a pervasive dread for the powerful. With no forensic science, such heinous acts often went unpunished, making suspicion a constant companion. Trust was scarce and loyalty often conditional. Ambitious vassals, disgruntled relatives, or even trusted advisors might see an opportunity to seize your power and riches, transforming a life of privilege into a labyrinth of paranoia. The feudal system, while providing structure, often lacked a strong, unified central government. This meant justice could be arbitrary and unpredictable. Local lords frequently waged private wars, dragging even the wealthiest figures into conflicts. Your standing could protect you, but it also made you a prominent target. Wealth could sometimes sway justice in your favor, yet it could just as easily make you a victim of false accusations or a powerful lord's ire. There was little consistent legal recourse against such abuses, leaving even the most affluent vulnerable to the capricious nature of medieval law. For those who were captured, the fate was often dire. Being taken for ransom was a very real possibility for wealthy individuals. A lord or lady, if captured, became a valuable commodity, leading to prolonged, agonizing negotiations over their release. The ransom demanded could be ruinous, potentially stripping a family of generations of wealth, leaving them impoverished and traumatized, even if ultimately freed. The shadow of such a fate loomed large over every noble house, a constant reminder that even the greatest fortunes could vanish overnight in the turbulent currents of medieval life. Thus, while the medieval rich appeared to dwell in an impenetrable fortress of wealth, their lives were, in reality, shadowed by a constant anxiety of external attack, internal betrayal, and the unpredictable nature of justice. Their very affluence, the symbol of their power, became an unbearable burden, marking them as targets in a world where security was a fleeting illusion. We have explored the battles against illness, the discomforts of castle living, the paradoxical challenges of medieval dining, and the chilling threats wealth attracted. Now, let us contemplate the most insidious burdens, the invisible chains of societal expectation and profound personal limitations that bound even the wealthiest in the Middle Ages. For many, privilege seems synonymous with freedom, yet, for the medieval rich, their very status often dictated every aspect of existence, leaving little room for true personal choice or tranquility. Imagine a life where fundamental personal decisions were not your own. For the noble, marriage was rarely about love. It was a calculated political and economic alliance. Daughters were pawns, traded for advantageous treaties or land. Sons were obligated to marry into families, bolstering lineage or bringing crucial wealth. Personal desires were overwhelmingly secondary to dynastic ambition. This lack of agency in choosing a life partner, unimaginable today, cultivated countless unhappy unions and bitter resentments, even within opulent households. Beyond the initial arrangement, immense pressure existed to produce heirs, particularly male heirs, the continuation of the family name, the unbroken succession line, the vast inheritance of lands and titles, all hinged critically on successful procreation. This burdened noblewomen with frequent, dangerous childbirths. Succession crises were common, erupting into brutal infighting and assassinations for power. The immense weight of an entire lineage rested heavily on the wealthy, transforming the promise of an heir into persistent, deep anxiety. What of leisure and intellectual pursuits? While modern wealth buys freedom for diverse hobbies and education, medieval rich found options surprisingly limited. Entertainment was largely dictated by status and ritual, hunting parties, feasts, or jousting. Refined personal hobbies or diverse intellectual pursuits for mere enjoyment were largely undeveloped. Literacy rates, even among nobility, were low, and book access restricted to religious texts or expensive manuscripts. The vast tapestry of global knowledge we effortlessly access today was simply beyond their reach. Perhaps the heaviest invisible burden was the pervasive influence of the church. It was a dominant political, social, and economic force. For the wealthy, this translated into immense religious obligations and a constant, terrifying fear of eternal damnation. They were profoundly expected to make lavish donations to monasteries, cathedrals, and charities. These acts, more than piety, were desperate attempts to secure heaven and shorten purgatory. Such donations often represented a substantial financial burden, dictated by unwavering social expectation and deep spiritual dread. Pilgrimages, arduous journeys were also expected, demanding further sacrifice of time and comfort. Finally, strict social hierarchy and rigid etiquette imposed a constant performance. Every aspect of a noble's life, attire, speech, gestures, public appearances, was dictated by unyielding codes. Immense pressure existed to maintain appearances and uphold status. This constant vigilance, the lack of freedom to simply be, could be profoundly exhausting. Individuality was often suppressed beneath layers of tradition and expectation. They were players in a grand, lifelong theatrical production, their roles rigidly defined by birthright. Thus, while the medieval rich appeared to dwell in an impenetrable fortress of wealth, their lives were, in reality, shadowed by constant anxiety. Their affluence, the very symbol of their power, often became an unbearable burden, marking them as targets in a world where security was fleeting. But even beyond these grand threats, The very fabric of medieval noble life imposed pressures and limitations that shaped their existence in ways we can barely imagine. As the whispers of their era gently unfold, let us now delve deeper into the daily constraints of their golden cage. We have begun to unravel the complex tapestry of burdens faced by the medieval rich, from the limitations of their medical knowledge to the silent anxieties embedded within their very existence. Now, let us delve into perhaps the most poignant and heartbreaking aspect of their lives, a sorrow that spared no social class, yet carried profound implications for the preservation of noble lineages, the pervasive specter of child mortality, and the immense dangers faced by women during childbirth. In an era before modern understanding of hygiene and medicine, the journey from cradle to maturity was fraught with peril, transforming the hope of an heir into a constant, agonizing gamble. Imagine the noble family, eager for the continuation of their prestigious line. Every pregnancy was met with anticipation, but also with a silent, underlying dread. For in the Middle Ages, infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high across all societal strata. While the wealthy could ensure better nutrition for their infants and perhaps slightly cleaner environments, they were by no means immune to the pervasive threats of childhood diseases. Fevers, coughs, sudden illnesses, often simple infections that modern medicine swiftly cures, could rapidly claim a young life. Imagine the emotional toll on noble parents, despite their ingrained acceptance of such loss. Each child born represented not only a personal joy, but also a vital piece of the family's future, a precious link in the chain of power and inheritance. The constant cycle of birth, hope, and often devastating loss cast a long, melancholy shadow over even the most opulent households. For the noble women themselves, the journey of motherhood was particularly hazardous. Childbirth stood as one of the leading causes of death for women in the Middle Ages. Each pregnancy, each delivery, was a life-threatening ordeal, often approached with prayers and a deep sense of resignation. Medical assistance during childbirth was extremely limited. Physicians, primarily men, were often reluctant to attend women in labor, viewing it as an undignified or overly intimate process. Instead, reliance fell almost entirely upon midwives, who, though experienced, operated with a profound lack of anatomical understanding, sterile practices, and effective interventions for complications. Imagine a noblewoman in the throes of labor within her cold, drafty chamber, surrounded by well-meaning but ultimately ill-equipped attendants. Prolonged labor, hemorrhages, and life-threatening infections such as puerperal fever, often caused by unwashed hands or unsterile environments, were terrifyingly common. The wealthy might afford a larger number of attendants, perhaps even a physician if one could be persuaded, but their collective knowledge was tragically insufficient. A difficult birth could drag on for days, exhausting the mother and often leading to agonizing decisions. If the child survived, the mother might not, leaving a family bereft and a lineage in crisis. The relentless pressure to produce male heirs exacerbated these dangers. Due to high child mortality rates and the absolute necessity of continuing the family line, noble women were often expected to endure frequent pregnancies, one after another, throughout their fertile years. This continuous cycle placed immense strain on their bodies, leaving little time for recovery and increasing the cumulative risk of complications with each successive birth. Each pregnancy was not just a biological event, but a profound social and political obligation, turning the natural act of creation into a demanding and often deadly duty. This pervasive reality of loss, from the earliest moments of life, shaped the emotional landscape of medieval nobility in ways we can only begin to comprehend. The quiet grief that must have permeated the nursery, the silent prayers for a child's survival beyond infancy, and the ever-present knowledge that a life so recently begun could be extinguished by a common fever or an unseen infection, cast a somber hue over the apparent grandeur of their lives. The hope of a lasting lineage was a constant, profound anxiety, a burden carried silently within the very walls of their magnificent strongholds. We have traversed the profound grief of child mortality and the immense perils faced by noble women in childbirth, understanding that wealth offered no true solace against these fundamental realities. Now, let us consider the more intimate, yet equally pervasive, discomforts that clung to the medieval rich daily, the silent battles against poor personal hygiene, and the persistent, nagging ailments that modern medicine has long since eradicated. These were not the grand, life-threatening plagues, but constant, low-level irritations that eroded genuine comfort and often disturbed peace of mind. Imagine the daily routines of a wealthy medieval noble, not in their grand attire, but in their raw human vulnerability. The concept of regular personal bathing as we know it today was practically non-existent. While some castles might have possessed basic bathhouses, often a simple wooden tub, baths were infrequent events, perhaps once a week or even less often, and often involved communal use of water. The water itself would likely be cold or lukewarm, heating vast quantities being an immense chore. Imagine the layers of dirt, sweat, and grime that would accumulate between these infrequent washings, contributing to a persistent underlying odor that perfume could only partially mask. The feel of perpetually unclean skin, the subtle itch from accumulated dust and dead skin cells would have been a constant, subtle irritant in their lives. Oral hygiene was virtually unheard of. Toothbrushes, toothpaste, and even the basic understanding of dental cavities were centuries away. The medieval rich, despite their access to a diet abundant in honey and expensive imported sugar, which they consumed freely, suffered terribly from rampant tooth decay. Imagine the constant dull ache of a cavity, the sharp pain of a raw nerve, or the excruciating throb of an abscess. Bad breath would have been pervasive, and tooth loss a common affliction, even among the young. The only remedies were often crude extractions performed by barbers or untrained individuals, agonizing procedures without anesthetic. Eating a feast with a toothache, or smiling with missing or decaying teeth, would have been an unavoidable reality, undermining any outward display of refinement. Beyond the visible discomforts, there were the unseen inhabitants, parasites. Regardless of social standing, lice, fleas, and bedbugs were ubiquitous. Imagine the constant, maddening itch of these tiny creatures crawling on your skin, in your hair, and within your lavish bed linens. While servants might meticulously comb for lice or attempt to fumigate, these efforts were largely ineffective. The wealthy, with their intricate clothing, elaborate hairstyles, and preference for furs, might even have inadvertently provided more inviting habitats for these unwelcome companions. Internal parasites, such as various worms, were also common, a consequence of contaminated water, improperly cooked food, and generally poor sanitation. These hidden invaders could cause chronic digestive issues, lethargy, and a general feeling of ill health, often without a clear diagnosis or effective treatment. Furthermore, medieval life, even for the rich, was replete with chronic aches and pains that went largely untreated. The cold and dampness of their castles undoubtedly contributed to widespread rheumatism and various forms of arthritis. Imagine waking each morning with stiff, aching joints, a constant reminder of the chill that permeated your living space. Even minor injuries, a twisted ankle from descending a treacherous spiral staircase, or a cut from a kitchen mishap, could become persistent sources of pain or fester dangerously due to the complete absence of antibiotics. Headaches, fevers, and various unexplained malaise were common companions, with no readily available and effective pain relief beyond perhaps heavy drinking or limited access to expensive herbal remedies like opium. These persistent, low-level discomforts, often unnoticed by historians focusing on grander events, formed a significant part of the daily burden of medieval wealth. They were a constant, nagging reminder that despite their riches, life was often a struggle against the mundane and the microscopic, leaving even the most powerful with a subtle, pervasive sense of unease. We have delved into the daily discomforts and the nagging ailments that plagued even the wealthiest in the Middle Ages, reminding us that true well-being was a luxury often beyond their grasp. Now, let us consider another profound absence within their magnificent strongholds: the complete lack of genuine privacy. In a world where every aspect of life was public, communal, and often observed, the noble, despite their elevated status, found themselves living in a constant, subtle spotlight, even within the supposed sanctuary of their own home. Imagine yourself a lord or lady surrounded by the immense stone walls of your castle. While these walls provided protection from external foes, they offered surprisingly little refuge from the ever-present eyes within. The Great Hall, the heart of the castle, was a multifunctional space: a dining room, a court, a reception area, and often a communal sleeping quarter. Even for the noble family, it was common to have their beds set up within this vast, open space, perhaps separated by thin curtains or screens. This meant that the sounds, smells, and activities of dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, servants, guards, guests, and other family members, were a constant, unavoidable presence, day and night. The very concept of a private room, as we understand it, a personal sanctuary where one could retreat into solitude, was largely alien to the medieval mindset. While smaller, more intimate chambers might exist, often referred to as solars or wardrobes, these were rare and usually served practical purposes like storage or dressing. They were seldom true private sleeping quarters, reserved only for the highest-ranking individuals, and even then, often shared with a spouse or close attendants. The pervasive lack of individual space meant that personal moments, quiet contemplation, or intimate conversations were almost impossible to achieve without an audience, however unintentional. And then there were the servants. A numerous retinue of servants was a paramount symbol of wealth and status. The more servants, the richer the lord. Yet this constant attendance came at a profound cost to personal space and autonomy. Servants were ever present, attending to every need, dressing you, preparing your bath, bringing your food, even helping you into bed. They overheard conversations, witnessed intimate moments, and observed every detail of your daily routine. While their presence was expected and necessary for the smooth functioning of a medieval household, it also meant living under perpetual observation, a silent surveillance that never truly ceased. Consider the simple act of bathing. As we discussed, bathing was infrequent. When it did occur, it was often in a portable wooden tub brought into a common area, surrounded by servants assisting with water and soap. There was no secluded private bathroom behind a locked door. Even basic bodily functions offered little solitude. Latrines, often mere holes in the castle walls, were frequently semi-public, or at least in close proximity to others. The complete absence of modern plumbing meant odors were pervasive, and privacy was a distant dream, even in moments of utmost personal need. This constant lack of privacy extended beyond the physical space to the social realm. A noble's life was a continuous performance. Every action, every word, every gesture was subject to scrutiny, not just by family and guests, but by the watchful eyes of their own household staff. Maintaining the rigid etiquette and demonstrating one's status was a demanding, exhausting obligation. There was little opportunity to genuinely relax, to shed the burdens of one's public persona, or to simply be oneself without the pressure of an audience. The expectation to always behave nobly and to manage appearances was a subtle, yet powerful, psychological burden. The cumulative effect of this perpetual observation and communal living was a profound loss of personal freedom and individuality. The rich, for all their power over others, exercised surprisingly little control over their own personal space or moments of solitude. They lived their lives as if constantly on display, their every movement a part of the grand tapestry of castle life. This unseen gaze, this constant presence of others, undoubtedly contributed to a deep underlying weariness, turning their grand abodes into elaborate yet confining golden cages. We have charted the course through the cold, the darkness, and the surprising lack of privacy within the grand medieval castle walls. We've seen how even immense wealth could not buy true solitude or comfort in these imposing structures. Now, let us turn our attention to an even more ubiquitous and fundamentally irritating aspect of noble life, a constant, rustling presence that permeated every corner of their magnificent abodes: the relentless infestation of vermin and pests. These were not external threats, but intimate, unwelcome companions, quietly gnawing at the very fabric of comfort and peace. Imagine the sounds of the castle after dark, not just the whistling drafts or the creaks of aging timber, but the scuttling and scratching from within the walls and rafters. Rats and mice were omnipresent, attracted by the vast food stores, the inevitable spills from kitchens and banquets, and the accumulation of waste. These rodents thrived within the sprawling stone complexes. They gnawed through tapestries, contaminated precious grains, and scurried across floors and even beds. Their presence was a constant reminder of the lack of control over their immediate environment, a stark contrast to the ordered, controlled image the nobility strove to project. The thought of these creatures moving silently through one's private chambers, or even over one's sleeping form, would have been a deeply unsettling yet unavoidable daily reality. Beyond the larger rodents, there were the myriad of smaller, biting irritants that clung persistently to medieval life. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were universal companions, sparing no social class, no matter how elevated. Imagine the constant, maddening itch that would plague a noble, regardless of their silk garments or fine furs. Lice would burrow into hair and clothing, while fleas, carried by rats and other animals, would infest bedding and floor coverings, delivering relentless, irritating bites. Bedbugs, insidious creatures, would emerge at night from the crevices of wooden bed frames, feasting on sleeping bodies, leaving behind itchy welts and disturbed slumber. While servants might engage in tireless combing for lice or attempts to air out bedding, these were often mere temporary reprieves in a never-ending battle. Flies and cockroaches, drawn by the pervasive odors of waste and food, were also ubiquitous. Imagine the drone of flies buzzing around food laid out for banquets, or crawling over surfaces in kitchens and pantries. Cockroaches, resilient and adaptable, would emerge in the darkness, traversing floors and walls, a silent testament to the challenges of keeping any large, active medieval structure truly clean. These weren't just nuisances, they were carriers of disease, spreading pathogens from waste to food, further contributing to the unseen health risks of the time. The wealthy possessed only rudimentary and largely ineffective methods for pest control. Cats and dogs might be kept, serving as hunters, but their efforts were localized and insufficient against a widespread infestation. Simple traps might catch a few, but the sheer reproductive rate of these creatures, combined with the structural complexities of castles offering countless hiding places, made systemic eradication impossible. The problem was not one of effort, but of understanding and effective tools. Poisons, if known, were dangerous to humans too, and the understanding of sanitation as a preventative measure was nascent at best. The psychological impact of living with this constant, unseen army of creatures cannot be underestimated. It contributed to a pervasive feeling of being unclean, of being invaded, undermining the very grandeur and superiority that wealth was meant to convey. The subtle discomfort, the constant itch, the rustling sounds in the night, all served as a relentless, visceral reminder of the limitations of medieval life, even for those at its very apex. Their elaborate homes, for all their impressive stone and soaring towers, were shared with an unwelcome multitude, ensuring that true peace of mind remained an elusive luxury. We have traversed the pervasive irritations of vermin within medieval strongholds, understanding that even the grandest castles offered no true escape from these tiny, uninvited guests. Our journey through the unseen burdens of wealth now leads us back to the banquet hall, not to marvel at the sheer quantity of food, but to quietly uncover the profound and often painful truth about the noble diet itself. An abundance of calories rarely equated to true nutritional balance, creating a unique set of health challenges for the privileged. Imagine the typical meal laid before a medieval lord or lady. The table would groan under the weight of roasted meats: venison, boar, beef, mutton, fowl of every description, alongside various fish from ponds and rivers. Dairy products, rich cheeses, and generous quantities of bread, often made from refined flours, would complete the scene. This was a diet rich in protein and fat, designed to project an image of power and provide sustenance for physically demanding lives. However, for all its impressive quantity, this diet was alarmingly narrow and deeply unbalanced, particularly by modern nutritional standards. The most glaring deficiency was the severe lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. While seasonal gardens might provide some greens during the fleeting summer months, throughout much of the year, especially winter, fresh produce was incredibly scarce. Vegetables that were consumed were often boiled for extended periods, a practice that, unbeknownst to them, stripped away much of their vital vitamin content. Root vegetables might be stored, but their availability and variety were limited. This meant that the noble palate, accustomed to the richness of meats and the sweetness of honey and wine, consistently missed out on essential vitamins, minerals, and dietary fiber that are crucial for overall health and well-being. This dietary imbalance was a silent, insidious enemy that manifested in a variety of painful conditions. Gout, which we touched upon earlier, was a particularly cruel affliction of the wealthy, caused by high levels of uric acid in the blood, often a direct result of excessive consumption of red meat, game, and rich alcoholic beverages like wine and ale. It led to excruciating inflammation and swelling in the joints, most commonly the big toe. Imagine the agony of persistent joint pain, rendering even simple movements a torment, all while surrounded by the very foods that brought on such suffering. This wasn't a punishment for gluttony, but a direct consequence of a diet thought to be the height of luxury. Beyond gout, other, less understood, ailments lurked. While rare for those with some access to fresh food, scurvy, a debilitating condition caused by severe vitamin C deficiency, could still be a threat if noble diets became too restricted or if fresh imports were unreliable. Symptoms like bleeding gums, lethargy, muscle pain, and extreme fatigue would slowly erode one's vitality. More commonly, the heavy, low-fiber diet led to persistent digestive issues. Chronic constipation, uncomfortable bloating, and indigestion were common companions to medieval nobility. The sheer volume of rich, difficult-to-digest food often left them feeling sluggish and unwell, despite their privileged access to the best provisions the land could offer. Furthermore, despite the outward appearance of opulence, the lack of dietary diversity meant that certain micronutrient deficiencies, though undiagnosed, were likely prevalent. Iron deficiency, for instance, could contribute to anemia, causing fatigue and weakness. The narrow range of food sources, dictated by availability, preservation methods, and social custom, ensured that even the most powerful were, in a nuanced sense, malnourished. Their wealth could buy them quantity and status, but not the holistic nourishment that modern science understands as fundamental to health. Thus, the medieval rich, sitting amidst their overflowing platters, were often unknowingly cultivating a silent, internal struggle. Their prized diet, meant to signify their elevated status, often became a source of chronic physical discomfort and hidden ailments, a persistent reminder that true well-being was a delicate balance that medieval abundance simply could not provide. We have explored the silent struggles against nutritional imbalance that plagued even the medieval wealthy, understanding that abundant feasts did not always translate into robust health. Our journey through the hidden burdens now brings us to a fundamental challenge of medieval living that impacted every single meal: the ceaseless battle against decay and the often harsh realities of food preservation in a world devoid of refrigeration. This was not a minor inconvenience, but a monumental logistical and culinary hurdle that profoundly shaped the very essence of medieval cuisine, and often brought subtle discomforts or outright dangers to the noble plate. Imagine the sheer scale of provisioning a great castle, a thriving microcosm of society with hundreds of mouths to feed, day after day through every season. In an era without cold storage, the urgency to preserve newly acquired food was paramount. Meat from the hunt, fish from the rivers, and autumn harvests of grains and vegetables had to be secured against the relentless march of time and temperature. This led to the widespread adoption of methods that, while effective in preventing immediate spoilage, fundamentally transformed the food itself, often at the expense of flavor and texture. Salting was perhaps the most common and vital preservation technique. Vast quantities of salt, often expensive and laboriously mined, would be used to cure meats and fish. Layers of salt would draw out moisture, inhibiting bacterial growth. While this allowed food to be stored for months, even years, it rendered the meat incredibly tough and intensely salty. Imagine a constant diet where every bite carried a powerful, briny punch, far from the subtle seasoning we apply today. Soaking and boiling might reduce some saltiness, but the original fresh flavor was often irretrievably lost, replaced by a monotonous, cured taste. This forced high consumption of salt also brought its own health challenges, adding to the body's internal burden. Smoking was another prevalent method, used for both meat and fish. Food would be hung in smokehouses, where the smoke from smoldering wood would impart a distinctive flavor while also acting as a preservative. This method, too, altered the food's natural taste and texture, often making it dry and imparting a strong, sometimes acrid, smoky essence. Drying, especially for fruits, vegetables, and some leaner meats, was also widely practiced, relying on sun or air to remove moisture. Imagine consuming dried apples that were intensely chewy, or cured fish that felt like leather, rather than the tender, succulent produce we enjoy today. While these methods were ingenious for their time, they were far from perfect. Despite the best efforts, spoilage remained a constant threat. Imperfect curing, unexpected humidity, or the sheer volume of food being processed meant that some provisions would inevitably turn. The best before date was non-existent. Instead, nobles and their cooks relied on sight and smell to detect spoilage. Imagine the subtle worry accompanying each meal. Was this meat truly safe? Did that stew smell a little off? The hidden presence of bacteria, though unknown, meant that even perfectly preserved food could carry pathogens. Mild indigestion, stomach upsets, or even severe food poisoning could arise from food that seemed acceptable to the eye. The logistical effort involved in this preservation was also immense. Hundreds of animals would need to be slaughtered and processed, tons of salt procured, and vast smokehouses maintained. This was a continuous, arduous process carried out by numerous servants, often in unpleasant conditions. For the lord and lady, it meant being constantly reliant on the diligence and skill of their household in ensuring a safe and continuous food supply. Any failure in this meticulous process could lead to not just culinary disappointment, but real hunger or widespread illness within the castle walls. Thus, the medieval rich, despite their overflowing larders, navigated a culinary landscape dominated by the flavors and textures of preservation, often at the expense of freshness and optimal nutrition. The constant battle against decay was a silent, demanding task, leaving them with a diet that was predictable in its cured taste and often unpredictable in its safety, a subtle yet pervasive burden on their gilded existence. We have delved into the ceaseless battle against decay and the compromises of preservation that shaped the medieval noble's diet. Now, as the faint scent of wood smoke perhaps lingers in your imagination. Let us step into the bustling, yet fundamentally perilous, heart of the castle. The medieval kitchen. This was a realm of immense activity and culinary creation, serving as the very engine of noble sustenance and hospitality. Yet, unbeknownst to its inhabitants, these kitchens were also silent breeding grounds for unseen illnesses, turning the very act of preparing food into a dangerous gamble, even for the most powerful and privileged. Imagine the scene. Vast, open fires roared, casting flickering light and clouds of smoke that mingled with the aroma of roasting meats. Ventilation was rudimentary at best, leaving the air thick and heavy. Unlike modern kitchens with their gleaming surfaces and running water, medieval kitchens were often constructed of rough stone or wood, materials that easily harbored dirt and bacteria. The fundamental absence of pressurized running water meant that cleanliness was a labor-intensive and often insufficient endeavor. Water for cooking and washing would be painstakingly fetched from wells, rivers, or cisterns, carried in buckets, and used sparingly, often communally, for various tasks. The concept of sterilization or disinfection was utterly unknown, a secret of the future yet to be unveiled. Hygiene practices, by today's standards, were rudimentary to the point of being almost non-existent. Cooks and their numerous assistants, often handling raw meat, poultry, and fish, would rarely, if ever, wash their hands between tasks. There was no understanding of cross-contamination. Shared wooden chopping boards, rarely thoroughly cleaned, would harbor unseen microbes. Utensils, often made of iron or wood, were simply rinsed, not sanitized. Food scraps and waste would accumulate, attracting an army of uninvited guests. Imagine the potential for illness with every step of the food preparation process. Unwashed hands touching ingredients, raw juices dripping onto prepared foods, and a general lack of cleanliness that permeated every corner. Indeed, the presence of pests and animals within the kitchen was a constant and grave concern. Kitchens, with their abundant food scraps and warmth from the hearths, were prime breeding grounds for rats, mice, and cockroaches. These rodents, carriers of numerous diseases, would scurry freely across floors, counters, and even over uncovered food. Flies, drawn by the smells of food and waste, buzzed incessantly, landing on everything and acting as airborne vectors of contamination. It was not uncommon for dogs and cats, employed to control the rodent population, to roam freely within the kitchen, inadvertently adding to the unsanitary conditions, with their own droppings and dander. The noble's food, meticulously sourced and prepared, was constantly exposed to these unseen contaminants, a silent threat lurking within every meal. The consequences of such conditions were predictably dire. Widespread foodborne illnesses. While medieval physicians attributed mysterious stomach upsets, debilitating fevers, and severe dysentery to bad humors or miasma, the true culprits were often unseen bacteria like Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria, thriving in the unsanitary kitchen environments. Entire households, including the lord and lady, could be struck down by illness after a communal feast. Imagine the silent fear of consuming a meal, knowing that severe stomach pain, vomiting, or debilitating diarrhea could follow. These were not minor discomforts, but serious life-threatening conditions in an era without antibiotics or modern rehydration techniques. Even if not fatal, such illnesses led to prolonged periods of weakness and suffering. undermining the very strength and vitality that wealth was meant to provide. Thus, the medieval kitchen, a hub of culinary wonder, was simultaneously a crucible of unseen dangers. The rich, for all their power and privilege, unknowingly entrusted their well-being to practices that constantly invited illness. The subtle burden of foodborne pathogens lurking within every carefully prepared dish was a constant, unspoken threat, ensuring that even the most extravagant banquets were shadowed by a pervasive sense of vulnerability, a silent cost of their gilded existence. We have explored the unseen anxieties of personal hygiene and the hidden perils lurking within the medieval kitchen. Now, let us shift our attention from the subtle internal threats to the overt existential dangers that constantly loomed beyond the castle walls. For the wealthy of the Middle Ages, their formidable strongholds, symbols of power and security, paradoxically served as glaring beacons, inviting aggression from ambitious rivals and desperate brigands alike. In a turbulent age, often lacking a strong central authority, the threat of external aggression was a constant, nerve-wracking reality. Imagine the dawn breaking over your vast estates, not with the promise of a peaceful day, but with the distant rumble of approaching hooves or the glint of sun on unfamiliar banners. Raids and skirmishes were a common scourge of the medieval landscape. Rival lords, fueled by greed, a claim to disputed lands, or an ancient family feud, might launch swift, brutal attacks. Their purpose was often to plunder your villages, devastate your fields, steal your livestock, and harass your peasantry, the very foundation of your wealth and power. These were not pitched battles for glory, but acts of economic warfare and terror, designed to weaken your resources and undermine your authority. While the castle itself might remain inviolate, the sight of your lands in flames and your people suffering would have been a profound personal loss, a constant reminder of vulnerability. Beyond these quick, devastating raids lay the ultimate test of a noble's strength and a castle's resilience: the siege. A siege was a prolonged, agonizing form of warfare, designed to break the will of those within the walls through starvation, thirst, and constant psychological pressure. Imagine being trapped within your own formidable fortress, watching as enemy forces meticulously encircled your domain, cutting off all supplies. Days would turn into weeks, weeks into months, as provisions dwindled, and disease often began to spread within the confined spaces. The psychological toll of isolation, the constant tension of waiting for an assault, and the sight of your family and garrison growing weaker would have been immense. The besiegers, determined to break your resolve, would employ terrifying siege engines. Trebuchets would hurl massive stones, dead animals, or even disease-ridden corpses over your walls, designed to collapse defenses and spread pestilence. Battering rams would thunder against your gates, their rhythmic thuds echoing the relentless assault on your defenses. Towering siege towers, bristling with archers, would slowly be pushed towards your battlements, threatening a direct breach. Each sound, each impact, would be a chilling reminder of the destructive power arrayed against you, turning your imposing castle into a claustrophobic trap. The eventual prospect of surrender, often leading to loss of lands, title, or even life, loomed large. Adding to this perpetual unease were the private wars and endless feuds that characterized much of the medieval period. In an era where kings often struggled to assert absolute control, many lords considered it their right to wage their own small-scale wars against neighbors for honor, land, or vengeance. These were not grand crusades, but localized, brutal conflicts that could erupt with little warning, drawing even the most powerful nobles into their destructive embrace. As a wealthy lord, you were obligated to maintain a strong garrison of knights and soldiers, constantly ready for battle, training, and drills. This was a massive financial drain and a source of perpetual anxiety, knowing that at any moment you might be called to defend your own holdings or ride to the aid of your liege. Thus, while the medieval rich possessed imposing castles and armed retinues, their lives were far from serene. The constant threat of external aggression, from swift raids to devastating sieges and personal feuds, was a pervasive shadow that undermined their apparent security. Their wealth, paradoxically, made them both powerful and terribly vulnerable, forcing them to live in a perpetual state of vigilance, a silent and exhausting burden of their gilded existence. We have contemplated the ever-present shadow of external aggression, learning that even the most formidable castles offered only partial sanctuary from ambitious rivals and devastating sieges. Now, let us venture beyond the protective stone walls into the vast, untamed landscape of the medieval world, where the very act of travel presented a new, insidious set of dangers for the wealthy. Unlike our modern journeys of comfort and ease, every medieval voyage, however short, was a perilous undertaking, often fraught with unseen threats that transformed necessary transit into a source of deep, underlying anxiety. Imagine setting forth from your castle, your retinue assembled, laden with precious goods and provisions. The roads of the Middle Ages were rarely the well-maintained, paved arteries we know today. More often, they were little more than ancient tracks, worn by centuries of hooves and cartwheels, turning into muddy quagmires after rain or dusty, rutted paths in dry weather. Bridges were scarce, forcing travelers to ford dangerous rivers. There were no clear signposts, no reliable maps as we understand them, leaving navigation largely to local knowledge and intuition. This primitive infrastructure alone made journeys slow, arduous, and constantly unpredictable, stretching travel times across vast and lonely stretches of land. But the physical challenges were merely the backdrop for the far more sinister human threats that lurked along these routes. There was no centralized, effective police force to patrol the sprawling kingdoms. Instead, vast stretches of countryside were lightly governed, if at all, creating havens for those who preyed on the vulnerable. Bandits, highwaymen, and impoverished ex-soldiers roamed freely, seeing the wealthy traveler as an irresistible, moving treasure chest. Their rich clothing, their laden pack animals, their visible retinue of armed guards, all signaled immense value. Imagine the constant vigilance required, the furtive glances into the thickets bordering the path, the sudden surge of adrenaline at the sight of a stranger. Every bend in the road, every shadowed copse, held the potential for a sudden, violent ambush. These attacks were not just about robbery. Often they escalated into brutal assaults or even kidnappings for ransom. A wealthy lord or lady was a valuable commodity, and being seized by outlaws meant agonizing negotiations, often leading to the loss of vast sums of money, lands, or years of personal freedom, while held captive. Even if your armed guard was numerous, they could be overwhelmed by a larger, more desperate band. The constant financial burden of maintaining a sizable armed retinue for every journey was a stark reminder of these ubiquitous dangers. Yet even this investment offered no absolute guarantee of safety. Beyond human malice, the medieval wilderness itself held its own dangers. While perhaps less frequent, encounters with dangerous wild animals, wolves, bears, or even wild boars, were a genuine concern in less populated areas, particularly at dusk or dawn. These encounters, though not a daily threat, added another layer of unpredictable peril to medieval travel, reminding even the most powerful that they were still subject to the untamed forces of nature. Natural obstacles like sudden floods, landslides, or impassable snowdrifts could also strand travelers for days, leading to exposure, hunger, or vulnerability to opportunistic predators, both human and animal. Thus, venturing outside the castle walls, even for the most essential reasons like visiting another manor, attending court, or going on pilgrimage, was a journey fraught with anxiety. The medieval rich, for all their power within their domains, found themselves remarkably vulnerable on the open road. The constant threat of ambush, robbery, and capture, coupled with the arduous conditions of travel, transformed every necessary movement into a stressful endurance, a silent, pervasive burden on their gilded existence. They were never truly at peace, for danger lurked just beyond the horizon of their fortified homes. We have charted the perilous paths and endured the visible threats that awaited the medieval wealthy beyond their castle walls. Yet, even as they sought refuge behind stone and steel, a different, more insidious danger often festered within their very midst. This was the chilling world of political intrigue, betrayal, and the silent, unseen weapons that transformed allies into adversaries and trusted confidants into covert executioners. For the powerful, wealth and influence were magnets not only for external foes, but for the quiet, deadly ambitions lurking in their own courts and even their own families. Imagine the Grand Hall not just as a place of feasting and ceremony, but as a chessboard where life itself was the stake. Your vast fortune, your extensive lands, your coveted titles, these were coveted by many. Rivals, eager to gain favor with the king, usurp your territories, or simply eliminate competition, might employ methods far more subtle and terrifying than a frontal assault. The constant need for vigilance against those closest, those who shared your bread and wine, became a profound, exhausting burden. Every smile, every seemingly friendly gesture could hide a dagger of deceit. Perhaps the most feared and insidious weapon in this game of power was poison. In an era devoid of forensic science, a carefully administered dose of a deadly substance could eliminate a rival without leaving a trace, often mimicking natural illness. Imagine the pervasive dread that must have accompanied every meal, every glass of wine. Was this dish truly prepared by a loyal hand? Had that goblet been tampered with? The wealthy, with their access to rare and exotic ingredients, were particularly susceptible to this silent killer, turning daily sustenance into a potential instrument of their demise. The agonizing suspicion that one's very food or drink could be a vector for betrayal was a constant, chilling companion. Beyond poison, overt assassination was also a chilling reality. A sudden fall from a horse, a hunting accident, or an unexpected attack by unknown assailants could be orchestrated to remove a powerful figure. These were rarely random acts, but calculated eliminations, designed to look like unfortunate mishaps or to simply vanish without trace. The finest armed guard, while deterring open attack, could do little against a trusted servant or a bribed confidant with a dagger in the dead of night. The wealthy often found themselves in a paradox, surrounded by people, yet isolated by fear, unable to fully trust those sworn to protect them. Betrayal, however, was not always so violent. It could manifest as a subtle shift of loyalty, a whispered slander campaign, or a carefully orchestrated frame-up designed to strip you of your lands, your influence, or even your reputation. Vassals sworn to fealty might break their oaths for a more promising lord. Disgruntled family members, a younger sibling envious of your inheritance, an uncle coveting your title, might plot your downfall from within. Trusted advisors, privy to your secrets, could turn against you for personal gain. The psychological toll of living in such an environment, where a network of supposed allies could turn into a labyrinth of deceit, was immense. The exhaustion of constant paranoia, the inability to truly relax or confide, created a profound sense of isolation amidst their own power. The medieval justice system offered little solace against such covert threats. Forensic science was non-existent, making it nearly impossible to prove poisoning or uncover hidden conspiracies. Crimes often went unpunished if the perpetrator was powerful, cunning, or simply adept at obscuring their tracks. Justice itself could be manipulated by the mighty, leaving victims with no recourse. This pervasive lack of accountability meant that even the richest, with all their resources, were fundamentally vulnerable to the machinations of those who sought their downfall. Their wealth, a symbol of their power, paradoxically marked them as targets in a world where true security was an elusive dream. We have navigated the treacherous currents of external aggression, the perilous paths of medieval travel, and the insidious webs of political intrigue. These were the omnipresent dangers that shadowed the lives of the wealthy, transforming their influence into a target. Now, let us contemplate perhaps the ultimate, most profound consequence of these threats: the very real prospect of capture and imprisonment for ransom. For a medieval noble, their immense wealth, while granting power, simultaneously rendered them a valuable commodity, turning their person into a bargaining chip in a brutal game. Imagine the sudden, jarring shock of capture. Perhaps you were overwhelmed in battle, ambushed on a seemingly safe road, or even cunningly kidnapped from your own lands by a desperate rival. Unlike the common soldier or peasant, a noble was rarely killed outright upon capture, for their value lay not in their death, but in their potential for ransom. This meant a chilling shift in status from a powerful lord or lady to a helpless prisoner, stripped of freedom, dignity, and any control over their fate. The immediate days and weeks after capture would be filled with terror, uncertainty, and the brutal reality of their new, confined existence. The conditions of medieval imprisonment, even for a noble captive awaiting ransom, were far from humane. Imagine being thrust into a cold, damp, and perpetually dark dungeon, often beneath the very castles you once admired. The air would be thick with the stench of human waste, decay, and the musty dampness of stone. Basic necessities were meager, perhaps a meager ration of bread and water, a pile of straw for a bed, and the constant company of rats and insects. Isolation would deepen the psychological toll, with only the distant sounds of the castle above serving as a cruel reminder of the world you had lost. Weeks could turn into months, sometimes even years, in this agonizing limbo as negotiations dragged on. The ransom process itself was a torment, not just for the captive, but for their family and entire lineage. Demands for enormous sums of money, vast tracts of land, or priceless treasures would be made by the captors. Imagine the frantic efforts of your family back home, selling off precious heirlooms, mortgaging lands, incurring massive debts, all to secure your release. These negotiations were often protracted and complex, involving emissaries, threats, and counter-threats, prolonging the captive's agony. There was also the constant fear of mistreatment, even torture by their captors, designed to pressure the family into meeting the demands. The physical and psychological abuse endured during captivity would leave indelible scars, even if the captive ultimately regained their freedom. Even upon release, if that day ever came, the consequences could be devastating. A noble family might emerge from the ordeal financially ruined, stripped of the wealth and influence it took generations to build. Lands might be lost, allegiances shifted, and the family's standing permanently diminished by the crippling debt. For the former captive, the trauma of imprisonment and the psychological burden of having been a commodity could lead to lasting paranoia, anxiety, and a profound sense of loss. Their strength, once a symbol of power, might be perceived as weakness, undermining their authority. The trust they once held in the world and in those around them could be shattered forever. Thus, the medieval rich, despite their apparent invulnerability, faced a chilling ultimate risk. Their very value could become their undoing. The prospect of capture for ransom and the subsequent horrors of imprisonment and financial ruin cast a long cold shadow over their opulent lives. It was a constant reminder that even the greatest fortunes could vanish overnight, leaving behind not just poverty, but a lasting legacy of fear and profound psychological scars, a truly unbearable burden of their gilded existence. We have faced the brutal realities of capture and ransom, understanding that even immense wealth offered no true shield against the ultimate loss of freedom and security. Now, let us turn to a different, more subtle kind of confinement, one woven into the very fabric of medieval noble society, the intricate web of arranged marriages and the relentless pressure for a male heir. For the rich, the choices we take for granted, who to love, who to marry, whether to have children, were rarely theirs to make, transforming personal life into a strategic chessboard. Imagine yourself as a young noble, perhaps barely a teenager, yet your future, your very destiny, has already been meticulously decided for you. For medieval aristocracy, marriage was seldom about affection or personal compatibility. It was, first and foremost, a meticulously calculated political and economic contract. Daughters were often considered valuable pawns, traded to secure advantageous treaties, expand vast landholdings, or solidify crucial military alliances. A powerful lord might offer his daughter's hand to a neighboring rival to end a feud, or to a king's loyal vassal to consolidate power. Personal desires, romantic inclinations, or individual happiness were overwhelmingly secondary, often entirely disregarded in the grand scheme of dynastic ambition and the cold logic of power. Imagine the emotional burden of entering a lifelong union with a stranger, knowing your fate was sealed not by your heart, but by parchment and political gain. Sons, though seemingly more independent, were equally bound by these societal imperatives. While they might have slightly more say in rejecting a truly undesirable match, Their primary duty was to marry into a family that would bolster their lineage, bring substantial dowries of land or gold, or provide vital military support. Their future, too, was often predetermined by the needs of their house rather than personal inclination. This complete lack of agency in choosing a life partner, a burden almost unimaginable to us today, cultivated countless unhappy unions, silent resentments, and often bitter intrigues within the most opulent households, where marital bonds were strategic, not emotional. Beyond the initial arrangement, the relentless pressure to produce heirs, particularly male heirs, was an immense and constant burden that hung over every noble couple. The very purpose of a noble marriage was often viewed as procreation, the continuation of the family name, the unbroken line of succession, the vast inheritance of lands, titles, and influence, all hinged critically upon successful procreation. Imagine the profound fear of dying without an heir, knowing your ancient lineage might face extinction, your lands forfeit, and your legacy crumble into dust. This anxiety was particularly acute for the lord. For the noblewomen, this pressure was often literal and terrifying. Their primary role and value became intrinsically linked to their ability to bear children, especially sons. Due to high infant mortality rates, they were frequently expected to endure numerous pregnancies throughout their fertile years, one after another, in a desperate attempt to secure multiple male heirs. As we discussed earlier, each childbirth was a dangerous ordeal in an era with primitive medical care. This continuous cycle of pregnancy and delivery placed immense strain on their bodies, leaving little time for recovery and significantly increasing the cumulative risk of complications with each successive birth. The very act of creating life became a demanding and often deadly duty, transforming the natural joy of motherhood into a profound burden of expectation. Succession crises were a recurring nightmare in medieval history, fueled by ambiguous claims, a lack of male heirs, or multiple ambitious claimants. These disputes frequently erupted into brutal infighting, fratricide, assassinations, and even devastating civil wars, plunging entire regions into chaos. Imagine the constant underlying anxiety of knowing that the very future of your family, your lands, and your power depended precariously on the survival of a fragile child, or the unwavering loyalty of ambitious relatives. The weight of an entire lineage, with all its associated responsibilities and potential pitfalls, rested heavily on the shoulders of the wealthy, transforming the promise of an heir into a persistent, existential dread, a silent burden within their golden cage. We have charted the intricate web of lineage and the heavy burdens of arranged marriages and dynastic pressures that constrained the medieval rich. Now, let us shift our gaze from the necessities of survival and succession to the less obvious, yet profoundly impactful aspect of noble life: the surprising scarcity of varied leisure activities and intellectual pursuits. In an age devoid of electric lights, printed books, or global communication, the daily existence of the wealthy, despite its outward grandeur, could often be remarkably monotonous and intellectually unstimulating, a silent burden upon their otherwise privileged lives. Imagine your day as a medieval noble, while you were spared the back-breaking labor of the peasant. Your time was far from filled with the diverse array of entertainment and personal development options available today. There were no streaming services, no vast personal libraries, No intricate board games beyond a few rudimentary ones, and certainly no global news to consume. Leisure activities were often deeply intertwined with one's status and practical skills, lacking the sheer variety and accessibility we now take for granted. Primary pastimes typically revolved around displays of power and physical prowess. Hunting, often involving falcons, hounds, and a large retinue, was a favored pursuit, offering both sport and the practical benefit of fresh meat. Jousting tournaments, while spectacular and social events, were dangerous and formal performances, not casual entertainment. Grand feasts, as we've discussed, were more often elaborate social and political obligations rather than purely relaxing meals. Musical performances by minstrels and jesters offered some respite, but even these would eventually grow repetitive. The endless cycle of managing your estates, training your soldiers, and attending to local justice would consume much of your day, leaving little time for the unstructured, truly personal leisure we cherish. Beyond mere amusement, the intellectual landscape for the medieval rich was strikingly limited compared to our modern world. While a select few might have access to tutors and learned clergy, literacy rates, even among the nobility, were surprisingly low. Many lords and ladies could sign their names or read simple texts, but profound scholarship was often left to monks and highly educated clerics. The concept of widespread education for personal growth or general knowledge was alien. Books were exceedingly rare and prohibitively expensive. Each copy was painstakingly transcribed by hand, often in monasteries, taking months or even years to complete. There were no public libraries, no vast private collections beyond a handful of precious manuscripts. Imagine living in a world where knowledge was guarded, difficult to access, and rarely disseminated beyond a small, specialized circle. The absence of modern scientific thought further constrained their worldview. Life was largely interpreted through the lens of religious dogma, tradition, and superstition. There was little understanding of basic biology, astronomy, or physics. The world felt smaller, governed by divine will and ancient beliefs, rather than observable phenomena and logical inquiry. Curiosity about distant lands was fueled more by fantastical tales than by accurate geographical knowledge. This narrow intellectual horizon, while not inherently bad, represented a profound limitation on mental stimulation and personal growth that we, with our immediate access to vast information, might find deeply constricting. The sum total of these limitations was a kind of subtle, pervasive boredom, a quiet intellectual hunger that wealth could not satisfy. Despite their material riches, the medieval noble often experienced a daily monotony, a routine dictated by the sun, the seasons, and feudal obligations, with limited avenues for genuine intellectual stimulation or diverse personal enjoyment. Their lives, while outwardly grand, were, in a nuanced sense, impoverished in the very breadth of human experience that modern society offers. This quiet scarcity of mental and recreational freedom was a subtle yet significant burden within their gilded cage. We have traversed the narrow confines of leisure and intellectual pursuits, understanding that even the wealthiest of the Middle Ages found their spirits surprisingly unburdened by diverse stimuli. Now, as our extensive journey through the hidden trials of medieval affluence draws to a close, let us contemplate the final, all-encompassing burden that weighed heavily on every noble's life: the immense pervasive power of the church and the spiritual anxieties it instilled. In the Middle Ages, the church was far more than a religious institution. It was an indomitable force shaping laws, morality, and even political power. Its authority extended into every corner of life. For the wealthy, this translated into immense religious obligations and a constant, terrifying fear of eternal damnation. The concepts of hell and purgatory were not abstract ideas, but very real, pressing anxieties. Imagine living with the perpetual dread that every sin could condemn your immortal soul to everlasting pain. This profound fear was a burden no gold could mitigate. To alleviate these fears and secure their place in heaven, the wealthy were profoundly expected to demonstrate piety through lavish donations. They poured immense sums into building cathedrals and monasteries, endowing charities. These were not just grand displays, they were desperate attempts to atone for sins, earn divine favor, and shorten purgatorial suffering. These donations, while seemingly voluntary, often represented a substantial ongoing financial drain, dictated by unwavering social expectation and deep-seated spiritual dread. Pilgrimages, arduous and dangerous journeys to holy sites, were also expected as penance and public faith, demanding further sacrifice. Strict religious doctrines imposed severe moral and behavioral constraints. Nobles were expected to adhere to rigid Christian codes, confess sins regularly, and perform penance. Certain pleasures were condemned. The constant vigilance over one's moral conduct, the pressure to demonstrate unwavering piety, and heavy financial contributions created a unique burden. It transformed living into a continuous spiritual negotiation where the stakes were eternal. The weight of salvation, intertwined with earthly wealth, was a heavy cloak draped over their lives. As the whispers of the medieval era now gently fade, we conclude our extensive journey into the unseen burdens of wealth. We have unraveled the paradoxes hidden beneath the glittering surface of medieval nobility. We have seen how their vast fortunes, symbols of power and apparent freedom, were often accompanied by relentless challenges, from primitive medicine and high child mortality to the unyielding cold, darkness, lack of privacy, and pervasive pests within their castles. From imbalanced diets and perilous food preservation to the hidden dangers of unhygienic kitchens, from external aggressions and treacherous travels to political intrigue, assassination, and the terrifying prospect of ransom and imprisonment. And finally, from the chains of arranged marriages and dynastic pressures to limited leisure, intellectual pursuits, and the overwhelming influence of the church. The medieval rich, for all their power, often lived within a gilded cage. Their wealth did not buy them comfort, health, security, or freedom. Instead, it brought unique anxieties, persistent discomforts, and profound responsibilities. Now, as these ancient burdens recede into history, may your own sleep be deep, peaceful, and undisturbed, a true luxury the most powerful of the Middle Ages could only dream of. Good night,